I say we get started, okay? Everybody can hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Okay, so I'm Pete Williams. I'm with Greater Champion Neighborhoods Firewise Community, like Francis Jorgensen is as well, and so is Vicky, by the way. And so Francis is going to introduce our speaker today, and then I'll make a comment about questions and so on, and then we'll get right into the slides that Denise will show to us. So Francis, why don't you do the introduction and then throw it back to me.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Denise is a plant and wildlife biologist who works with private landowners, state and federal agencies, nonprofits, and complete projects in native plant conservation, habitat restoration, and wildlife-friendly fuel reduction. Now, isn't that exactly what we wanted to hear? So we are so glad she's here finally, and we've got all of our questions ready to ask her. So let's get started. So turn it over to Denise.
Well, before you do that, just let you guys know that you can ask questions in two ways. You'll see on her, I think her second slide, that she's got 4 or 5 topical areas. And so what we thought we'd do, if you want to ask the question verbally, which we'd prefer, then ask those questions at the end of each section so she can hear them and we can answer them in real time. If that's not to your liking, then you're welcome to put questions into the chat and we'll see if we can read them out at the appropriate time or at the end. So Denise, go ahead and start. And when you see that, I think it's the second slide, you'll see that, again, her presentation has 4 or 5 parts and we'll answer questions at the end of each section. So Denise, are you ready to put your slides back up?
Yeah, are they up?
I'm seeing no, you had them up and then they went away. So back to share screen. Now I'm seeing everybody's, we got 20 people and we're seeing the Hollywood Squares version of Zoom, seeing everybody's picture.
Nice. I am trying to find. Oh, there it is. Yeah, my screen got hidden somewhere.
Okay.
So let's see here. Do I need to share it again?
Apparently, because we're not seeing it now.
Oh, that's weird. Okay. Well, let's share it again. Window, PowerPoint.
Here we go. Coming up. There we go.
That works?
Yep. Good.
Great. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I am very happy to be here with you all today, this evening. I've spent a lot of time working in Deer Creek, both Upper and Lower Deer Creek. And as you all know, it's a really special place, but both in culturally, historically, and biologically. And we also know that it is at risk of catastrophic fire and impacts from that. And we're all learning that we need to make changes in how we approach the protection of our homes and communities while living in a fire-dependent ecosystem, which California is. I am currently, my current project is working with the YWI Watershed Institute up at the Inman Forest, which is BLM land. And there is fuel treatment, forest health and resilience projects happening up there. They've been happening for several years now, and we've got plans to continue that work up there on the San Juan Ridge. But I've worked throughout Nevada County and Grass Valley and Nevada City. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge the original caretakers of the Deer Creek watershed and surrounding area, the local Nisenan tribe. And with their ancestral knowledge, they've managed the land with fire and tended it with seeding, planting, coppicing, harvesting native plants, and we're in a good relationship with wildlife. And currently now, the tribe who is active and concerned about the Deer Creek watershed are working together to manage the watershed as best we can. And I certainly hope that I can gain the knowledge to steward nature in the way that it should be and has been naturally. So I might go through some of my slides fairly quickly. Some of them I don't want to spend a lot of time on. I know you've already heard about, and I'll have a bunch of pictures and then some slides. There'll be a bunch of writing words. I'll talk through those, but the nice thing about having a pre-recorded Zoom presentation is that you can go back and look at that. Look at the questions and the content. So in preparing this presentation, my question was, how can communities prepare for fire and at the same time protect biological diversity, native plants and wildlife, their habitats, and watershed health? Here's the outline of what I'll be talking about. First, I'll talk briefly about the community fire preparedness, which the Firewise coalition and communities are a part of. I'll be talking about the bigger picture of watershed functions and fire regimes. Then I'll dive into more specific information on the local wildlife and plants. Forgot to put plants in there, and their habitats. And finally, I'll be talking about watershed and wildlife-friendly fuel reduction treatments. And those would include wildlife-friendly practices and protections, as well as fuel treatment practices and their pros and cons. We'll get more into the details a little bit later. So these next few slides, I want to just pass through fairly quickly because I know the community has talked a lot about this, about structure hardening and defensible space. But when we're considering treating thousands of acres in wildlands, we really need to have a starting place, and that starting place is our own homes, and using the resources and the science behind our own defensible space and structure hardening. If you haven't heard of Jack Cohen, he has done extensive studies on flammability of homes that have been hardened and their ability to withstand intense fire. And so I've got a resource down here at the bottom of the screen, a little bit more information on him and his studies. And basically his thought is that we don't have just a wildfire problem, we have a home and structure ignition problem. And this photo of paradise down on the lower right shows that where the forest seems to have withstood a pretty high intensity fire pretty well, but the structures have been destroyed. Here are a couple resources that I'm sure you guys have already looked at, or projects that you're already doing on your homes. But again, it's like starting at home, and we're responsible for keeping us safe in our homes before we start impacting the homes and habitat of our native wildlife and plants. So. Defensible space goes outside of the home itself, the structure up to approximately 100 feet from the structure. There's a lot of information on this as well online. And in addition, I wanted to point out that the California Native Plant Society's local Redbud chapter has some very good information on their website regarding native plant gardening and landscaping, as well as fire tolerant, drought tolerant native plants that can be used around your home. So now I'm going to jump into talking about the bigger picture, which is the watershed function and fire regimes. Looking at the past and how the watershed has developed natural processes to keep everything in balance. A couple of things that are really important that I think about all the time when we're doing fuel reduction or fuel treatment, and also knowing that we are at a very concerning time regarding drought and heat and climate change and plant health. Both the soil biology and the hydrologic cycle have an extremely important role in keeping watersheds balanced and able to function as they normally would. With the soil biology, we're looking at the down and dirty, the nitty gritty of the hundreds of thousands of microbes and roots and soil particles that help support our forests and our native plants. They help the soil infiltrate water and hold water. They are vital in decomposing plant and animal tissue. And that soil biology, that carbon storage is intricately tied with the hydrologic cycle. And that is something that is extremely important to us now in this time of severe drought, continuing drought, where we need to really focus on getting the water that we do have in our short rainy seasons down into the soil and into the groundwater, where it can be stored for later and provide important resources, both in riparian areas and also keeping the trees, the forests and the trees that we do have healthy. So all plants and wildlife and humans depend on these cycles. And here's a couple of resources down below. The Soil Food Web talks about the amazing world of soil biology, and OAEC is the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, where they are doing a lot of work. Brock Dolman is doing a lot of work on watershed health and how to make the most of the water that we have, both in sustaining ecosystems and wildlife, as well as humans. So I urge you to look at some of that information. Okay, so in addition to the hydrologic cycle and the soil biology, fire has been an incredibly important and forming role in our plant communities that we have here in California. Many species are completely dependent on fire. Where they that is one of their best niches is after fire, is to come back in and repopulate areas that have been burned. What they're doing is they're responding positively to opening of canopies, whether it's chaparral or deep forest canopies. When you get more light and more water, more rain, more nutrients, wildlife is really able to take advantage of that. During fires, seedbeds are prepared and plant germination is initiated, which is a normal disturbance process that happens in California. And that is how we, through fire, we gain many different microhabitats that support diverse wildlife, and they provide incredible food sources and as far as shelter and breeding, mating, and rearing young. These are really important locations post-fire. So the risk of doing nothing. Well, after, I guess it is almost over 100 years of fire suppression in the Sierra Nevada, we have a lot of catch up to do as far as stewarding the wildlands in a way that we can get them back to their natural regimes, their natural fire regimes. The risks of us doing nothing are the impacts from catastrophic fire that are a result of that fire suppression. In addition, drought and climate change, which we've really been noticing recently, has accelerated in a way that because of what humans have done to the forests in the past, we have a responsibility to help steward these forests and communities to get back to a more normal homeostatic equilibrium. Risk of doing nothing, we risk the loss of our watershed functioning, our carbon sequestration, and our food chains, which is part of the soil biology and the hydrologic cycle that I talked about earlier. We also risk losing plant and wildlife diversity, as well as the resiliency of those populations to continue in the light of fire suppression, drought, and climate change. We risk losing many of our species that are found in the Deer Creek watershed that have evolved with fire. These are plant species that are sensitive, rare, threatened, and/or endangered that are within the greater Deer Creek watershed. And these species have evolved again with fire, liking to grow, such as the Humboldt lily and the Butte County fritillary, liking to grow on forest edges where there are a mosaic of plant community types, and the blue elderberry, which we could have in lower Deer Creek, is the host of an endangered beetle, the valley elderberry beetle. So these species that have evolved with fire are dependent on us continuing to either reintroduce fire into our watersheds or do fuel treatments that can best mimic a natural fire. Other things we risk of losing by not doing anything as far as fuel treatments or forest management would be these sensitive wildlife species, which are also found within the greater Deer Creek watershed. The California spotted owl and the northern goshawk really depend on mature forests with a dense understory. And they would be extremely impacted if a catastrophic wildfire came through the greater Deer Creek watershed and basically does burn down all of that older, mature forest growth with a dense understory. Other species like the Cooper's hawk and the foothill yellow-legged frog and the western pond turtle, these species use a variety of different habitat types. The Cooper's hawk is a accipiter, so it's like a falcon that searches for food through mixed conifer forest, and to have a mosaic of densities, a diversity of plant densities in forests really improves foraging and hunting abilities for the Cooper's hawk, as well as other birds of prey. The foothill yellow-legged frog and the western pond turtle. They are riparian-based species, obviously, and they do require some disturbance in the ecosystem. The foothill yellow-legged frog really needs to be near water, but it also needs to have adequate sunlight, so an adequate open canopy to allow sun into the riparian areas. And that sun is a very important part of its immune system. The western pond turtle, mostly found in creeks and ponds, also relies on adjacent woodlands, oak and conifer woodlands for laying eggs and estivating through the summer. We also have 2 species of bats that have not actually been documented that I know of in the Deer Creek watershed, but they have the potential to be here. A research on the status of bat populations and habitat in general is quite lacking, but yet the Deer Creek watershed does provide potential habitat for all of these species. We risk, if we don't do anything, we risk losing a variety of habitat types, which are homes to many birds. Recent studies show that a 30% decline in breeding birds in North America in the past 50 years has occurred. 30%, that's incredibly large number. And these are common birds that we have within our community. The homes to birds that the Deer Creek watershed provides is very diverse. We've got forest canopies that are closed canopies with mature forests where you would find more of the California spotted owl and the northern goshawk. We've got shrub and understory plant communities where you would find more of our California quail, our spotted towhee, things like that, that really need to have that low growing foliage. We've also got birds that thrive on the forest and shrubland edges, where there is a variety of different food sources, and also these forest and shrublands provide shelter. Some of our migratory birds that come through and use the Deer Creek watershed to breed are both the orange-crowned warbler and the yellow-rumped warbler, and they can particularly be found in thickets, shrubs, mid-canopy, forest edges. So you're seeing that there's a variety of habitats that are needed to support these birds. Finally, we have the mid to upper canopy tree birds, which would include a migratory species, the western tanager, which is one of our most vibrantly colored birds that we find here in the Sierras, western slope of the Sierras. And also in more the upper canopy of trees, we've got band-tailed pigeons, which are actually in a state of decline. Research hasn't really shown why, but they could just be falling into this 30% decline of birds that we have in our habitats. But band-tailed pigeons are extremely important when they feed us flocks on flowering trees and shrubs like madrone and toyon and things like that. They're an important source of seed dispersal. So all of these birds have an important role, not only in filling these niches of plant communities, but also continuing to propagate and to support those plant communities by spreading seeds throughout the watershed. The Deer Creek watershed is home to many, many species of wildlife. This is just a short list of maybe some of my favorites. All of these species live in very different niches, very different microenvironments, and they rely on having that diversity of habitats. For example, species that can be found on shrub, on the shrub/forest edge would be the gray fox or the bobcat or mountain lion, as they provide important location for shelter as well as hunting potential for food resources. We've got ring-tailed cats that are likely in the area that inhabit mid-canopy to a whole diversity of habitats, including your attic, if they're able to get in. They're elusive, they're here, but they are also a very important part of our ecosystem and provide important functions as far as spreading seeds, and they nest. They can be found in old growth trees, snags with large cavities, or they would be nesting in root balls that have a hole that they can excavate out and go den in. The understory species that we have, we find a lot of the bottom of the food chain, including wood rats or deer mice, which are very important for seed dispersal as well as prey food for other predators. We have the western pond turtle, which is a species of special concern in California. They're found in ponds, creeks, and woodlands. They are also found in edge habitats because they need both sun as well as woodland shade, where they will go to lay eggs and estivate, kind of a type of hibernation for reptiles through the hot summer months. We've got the Sierra newt and alligator lizard that would be found under wood and living in small mammal burrows. And finally, here we've got the terrestrial mammal species that are found in living in both terrestrial and mammal burrows. Those would be like California voles and king snakes and things like that. So we've got a variety of important microhabitats in which these individual species occupy and have an important role in sustaining. We've also got an incredible amount of insects and invertebrates being along the creek. In particular, we've got aquatic insects that are really important indicators of water quality. And those would be, here on the left side, we've got a mayfly, a stonefly, caddisfly, dragonflies, things like that, which are also important food sources for birds and fish, as well as bats. I'm sure many of you have seen the large groupings of ladybugs that we've got, which are important food sources. We've also got a variety of wood-boring beetles that are an important food source and do have roles in the forest health and forest succession. Even here we've got down on the bottom, the center of the beetles, that is a bark beetle. Bark beetle infestations and larvae in dying ponderosa trees provide an incredibly important food source for pileated woodpeckers and acorn and downy and hairy woodpeckers, all of the woodpeckers that we have here. We've got a whole variety of them. So not only are they providing roles within the ecosystem, whether it's decomposition, breaking down wood, or eating smaller insects, but they have a larger role in the cycles of the forest. Birds and snags. This is a birds and snags. It's like a love affair between birds and snags. Snags are extremely important for many species. In fact, a standing dead snag can provide more habitat to more organisms sometimes than even a living tree can do. Insects reside in the dead and dying wood. They help decompose and break down that wood, and they're also incredibly important food source for birds and bats. The snags also provide hunting perches for raptors and owls. And cavities created by woodpeckers provide homes for secondary cavity nesters, such as the bluebird, tree swallow, white-breasted nuthatch, oak titmouse. We've got many, many cavity nesters here in the Deer Creek watershed. Yeah, so bats also can roost in large snags as well. And I think that's something that we really need to be considering a lot more, is the health of our bat populations, as well as their necessary habitats. So snags are very important to many, many different forms of wildlife. Moving on to downwood. Downwood is an incredibly important structural habitat feature for many different kinds of wildlife. And they are so important that they really need to be taken into consideration when we do fuel treatments. They could take over decades to recover and or become important wildlife habitat after either a fire or fuel treatment that did not protect the downed wood. And they're extremely important because they do create that ground level complexity, which provides micro niches for a whole different types of wildlife, from insects and vertebrates to amphibians and small mammals. They're incredibly important in providing cool, moist cover for these species, particularly the Sierra Nevada and Santina, which is found down in the lower right-hand corner of the slides. They basically breathe through their skin, and it is incredibly vital for them to stay in cool, moist environments, and could really be impacted negatively from removing those environments by either moving the downwood or the canopy that helps keep the vegetation in general cool and moist. Downwood in the longer term is really important in releasing nutrients and water into the soil. They help slow water runoff by acting as a sort of catchment structures to slow spread and sink the water so that it actually makes it down into the soil to the tree roots and into the groundwater, hopefully. They let's see, they also help reduce erosion during intense rain events. They can also catch water and help prevent erosion. And as mentioned earlier, downed wood provides incredible habitat for food, particularly beetles, insects, invertebrates, centipedes, millipedes, and all their larvae as well are some of the most important parts of the food chain. Yeah, so as far as downed wood and retaining downed wood while you're doing fuel treatments, not all downed wood provides that level of habitat importance. We're really looking at logs and branches that are 8 to 10 inches in diameter, and so that they can provide the amount of cooling and moisture retention that species need. Okay, so this might be a good time for me to ask if there are any questions just regarding sort of the background regarding the wildlife that we have, our sensitive plant and animal species, the bigger picture, Deer Creek, fire dependent ecosystems. Does anybody have any questions regarding that before I move on to talk about fuel treatments and possible impacts on wildlife?
Hi, this is Lisa Macrina. I have a question regarding, is there any kind of census being taken of these different creatures and kind of what their populations were a time ago and maybe what they're looking like now, especially because there are a lot of efforts with property owners and the city and the county and everybody, trying to reduce the fuel load. But it's also the habitat. So I'm kind of curious, is anybody looking at what the impact of that fuel reduction is having on the census features?
That's a great question. So locally, I know that there are some nonprofits like Sierra Streams Institute and YWI Watershed Institute and probably some others as well that have been collecting data on these species, wildlife species, as well as plant species. But overall, I think that many of the fuel reduction or fuel treatment work that is happening, particularly on private land, may not take plant and wildlife impacts into account as much as they should. I don't know what level agencies like the Nevada County or the Fire Safe Council are required to go through environmental analysis, which would be through CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, that requires projects really look at the impacts on many things, but particularly in this case, plants and wildlife. And a lot of those required environmental analyses really only look at species that are considered sensitive, endangered, threatened, and they don't really look at all of the other species that are important in keeping not only the biological diversity of our watersheds healthy, but also understanding the roles in the bigger picture that those species contribute to the health of the forest and plant communities. So I would like to, I'll give you a little bit of more resources later on how private landowners can do their own research on many of these species that we're concerned about. As I put on one of the earlier slides, we're looking at loss of common bird species at like 30% loss in the past, I think they said like 50 years. So I think that all of the wildlife really needs to be taken into account. And if we can create our fuel treatments in a way that can benefit the maximum number of plants, native plants and wildlife, we really need to be doing our research and our on the ground surveys and our meetings and our planning to consider many of these more common species as well as the more rare ones. So hopefully that answered your question, probably a little bit more than you wanted.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Lou.
Hi.
When we have a sudden increase in the amount of fallen wood like we had after the December snowstorm, how do we estimate how much of that should be removed for fire protection? And how much should we keep for habitat protection?
That's a very good question. So one step in that decision matrix would be fallen debris such as branches and needles and leaves and things like that. More of the lighter fuels are not really what I'm talking about when I am talking about downed wood. We're looking at having logs and branches that are like 8 to 10 inches minimum. So these are larger pieces of wood that are probably like 1,000-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels. They're not the light flashy fuels. So it's those larger pieces of wood and logs and down trees that we would want to keep on the landscape. Those, especially ones that are older, downed logs take decades and decades to actually get to the point where they have decomposed enough to provide some type of habitat for certain mammals, amphibians, reptiles. So basically, it's a balance. If you're going to leave any downed wood on your property or on in a fuel treatment area, you want to make sure that it's not a ladder fuel, that it's not at the base of a tree, in which case it becomes more of a fuel hazard. As far as the down logs, if you are on a really steep slope, you actually, where you might have a concern for erosion, you might want to actually keep more of those down logs because they can help improve the soil and the water infiltration and the health of the trees that are growing around it. As far as the density goes, it's really a site-specific decision on what to keep and what needs to go, and that's really looking at the overall fuel load of the site. But really, we're looking at larger pieces of wood, 8 to 10 inches, not all of the branches and things like that. So if you do keep a large log, a large tree that fell down, I would recommend that you go and you cut off all of those branches and all of the needles and leaves because those are really what become more of that fire hazard, that light flashy fuel load.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One
Anybody else?
question. Question on blackberries in
Oh, yeah.
a riparian area or seasonal riparian area. And I just don't know whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. I hear both.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I am going to talk about invasive
Okay.
plants, and particularly blackberry later. But yeah, maybe I'll just wait to do that.
Okay.
But let me just say now, in case I forget, blackberry is invasive. It's incredibly invasive, especially through all of our NID canals and our ponds and everything. And it does overtake important native riparian plant species and habitats and food sources. However, on the list of all of the overwhelmingly dense and large populations of invasive plants like Scotch broom and such, blackberry does provide an adequate surrogate for wildlife habitat. It does provide a shelter from predators. It can provide shade and cool microclimates during hot summer months. It is obviously a food source, and many of our riparian shrub birds, many of them are migratory birds, such as warblers and chats and things like that. They will use blackberry for nesting and living because it is an appropriate surrogate. However, blackberry is also a fire hazard. Year after year, when we've got dead canes on top of dead canes, it is a fire hazard. So if you are looking to reduce blackberry for fuel treatment, fuel reduction, it's better to do it in a way that is timed. First of all, not to be done during bird nesting seasons, but also realizing that it is a habitat. You don't want to take it all out at once. And so you want to kind of phase that treatment of blackberry. All right.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so now that we've talked about the considerations for, impact, now that we've talked about wildlife, sorry, I got a little distracted. Let's talk about our fuel treatment projects and planning. What kinds of things do we need to consider in order to protect the biodiversity and the wildlife of the site with which we're working? One thing that's really important when we're looking overall at that landscape level is that we understand what habitat is needed for breeding, producing and rearing of young, feeding, refugia from predators, and also protection from adverse environmental conditions. Basically, like what we were just talking about with blackberry here, blackberry is non-native, but it does actually provide some of these habitat essentials, as just mentioned here first, although it's not ideal as compared to a more native riparian plant community. We also need to look at the species distribution and abundance of our local wildlife. We might be just looking at Deer Creek Watershed, in which case maybe we might have a lot of something. We actually, that's quite awesome, but we do have quite a few orange-crowned warblers and various other migratory birds. But we also we need to consider not just where they are during their breeding season, but also what are their migration patterns and dispersal. What other sort of plants or wildlife do they interact with at other times in their life cycle? And also how much can species be affected by potential change in whether it's like the climate or after fire. Some species are very resilient and adaptable, and some are much less, where they need very specific requirements. We need to look at the size and scale of the time, actually, the time in which work is being done, as well as the scale of treatments, and what wildlife is present in that treatment area at the time in which treatments are planned to happen. If we understand the spatial and temporal aspects of wildlife, then we can plan our fuel treatment projects around those requirements of many of the wildlife species that would live in our work site. And overall, it's are fuel treatments good or bad for wildlife? Well, there's as many answers to that question as there are species out there in our watersheds. Some species who are very resilient and can occupy and make the most of a variety of different habitats may do very well in locations where fuel treatments have been done. Some of these species would be the gray fox or the Cooper's hawk or the mountain lion, which are they're real hunters, and having these different edge effects and mosaics in plant communities offer a lot of different types of hunting possibilities and food sources. Other things such as native plants and wildflowers and the pollinators, the insects and vertebrates that depend on those could very well benefit from fuel treatments and opening up of the canopy and improving sunlight and reducing nutrient and water competition. Those species may do very well. Other species that are less adaptable, particularly ones that rely on closed canopies or high density of understory shrubs, in addition to complex structures such as the downed wood and snags, may not benefit from fuel reduction or fuel treatment work. Some of these species include the California spotted owl and the northern goshawk, which really do rely on more of those dense, mature forests. In addition, the Sierra Nevada and Santina is not going to do as well with the opening up the canopy and increased sunlight and temperature. So when we're planning fuel treatment work, we really need to look at these different species and what they need to survive and throughout their life cycle. In which case, mosaic treatment of fuel reduction or fuel work is beneficial to the most number of species, as long as you keep areas that are not treated those areas that are not treated in the fuel treatment project would be set aside to support species like the spotted owl or the goshawk, where treatments could actually be detrimental to their life cycle, their breeding, their hunting, and things like that. At the bottom of this slide, I've got a couple of references that I found working on this presentation that were really helpful. The first one is the wildlife and invertebrate response to fuel reduction. And that is put out by the Forest Service, and you can look at that online, and it goes much more into depth about it's sort of a meta-analysis on a bunch of different research that's been done. And I found a lot of things I could tell you about that, but I couldn't put it all in there. So I think it would be something you'd enjoy looking into. And then also the Joint Fire Sciences program, which I think is out of Idaho and studies fire in the West. They have a fire surrogate study. They've got a list of publications that talk about research of different fuel treatments and impacts on different type of wildlife. So that would be something I'm sure you would all be interested in. Okay, so now I'm going to move into talking about native and invasive plants and their flammability. So tying into the habitat needs for much of the wildlife we just discussed, our native plants, our wildflowers, our herbaceous perennials, our shrubs, and our trees that grow in a variety of habitats, from riparian to Manzanita chaparral, into mixed conifer and ponderosa pine. Those are the kind of species, plant communities that we're mostly looking at in the Deer Creek watershed. These species that are on the slide here in particular are more so flammable. No plant or tree is going to be inflammable. These are just less flammable. So if they are less flammable and they provide a higher wildlife habitat value, these are species that we really want to protect, and we want to keep within the area that we're working. We're doing fuel reduction because they have so much to offer. I'm not going to go through all of these species, but you could look them up on your own if you want to find out about where they grow and maybe even the wildlife that depends on them. I've put some resources down at the bottom of the slide that are really helpful in learning more about these plants. There's pictures to help you identify, and then also the Redbud California Native Plant Society has more information on plants, low flammability native plants on their website. Yeah, this is some good stuff. This is all food. It's all like food and shelter. You know, you've got pollen and nectar for pollinators. You've got the foliage for the insects. These species are high producers of berries, nuts, and seeds. And they also provide important material for shelter and nesting. So some of the higher flammability plants that we have in a greater watershed have characteristics such as producing a large volume of litter and dead material. They have dense growing habits with high volume of vegetation. which you can see down here on the lower set of pictures. That is a young manzanita bramble full of mostly dead branches. And a lot of these most of these high flammability species also contain volatile substances such as oils, resins, wax, or pitch. Here on the right, no, actually, I guess it's the left photo. There is an oak tree with a pink flag tied around it. It is surrounded by hundreds of dense young incense cedar. That is incredibly flammable. Cedars in general are incredibly more flammable than many of our species as compared to like sugar pine or things like that. But in that density and with the amount of dead material that that they produce, that really is that is really something that needs to be taken care of as far as reducing the vegetation density and the fire intensity potential due to the amount of fuel. So we naturally have, these plant communities, the manzanita, coyote brush, and gray pine mixed in with our conifer mixed oak woodland forests. Yes, they are high flammability plants when they are in large patches, when they're found as ladder fuels under larger trees and things like that. But just because they're high flammability doesn't mean we don't want them. They produce just as much important wildlife habitat as the low flammability species. Coyote brush can host up, I don't even remember, it's like hundreds of different insect pollinator species and bird species. Just one species, one shrub provides so many different types of habitat values to different wildlife. So what we want to do in areas where you've got dense patches of manzanita, coyote bush, gray pine is we just want to thin them out. We want to remove them from areas where they're acting as ladder fuels. And because there is a place for them, and they do have a vital role. If we could just reduce the amount of flammability, ladder fuel, and the perpetuation of fire across a landscape, then that's better. Some of the other high flammability plants that we have, the canyon interior live oaks, they are higher flammability species. They are, however, they're fire adapted. If we had regular low, moderate intensity fires through our wildlands, they would be a lot less flammable because they would have been cleaned out. The understory would have been cleaned out. But right now, when we're talking about doing fuel reduction with canyon and interior live oaks, many of them have been cut previously, so they're multi-trunked trees rather than a single trunk, which the multi-trunk trees actually does increase the flammability and the amount of fuels. So if we can just thin those trees out rather than cutting them all out, that is ideal to reducing the fuel loads. And some of the most, probably almost the most flammable species that we have within our communities are non-natives that are planted as horticultural plants on our private properties and landscapes. Things like eucalyptus, juniper, oleander, rosemary, ivy, and the exotic conifers are should be the first to be removed as far as reducing fuel. They have all of these characteristics with oils, resins. They produce a high volume of vegetation and a lot of litter and dead material. So if you're going to start with removing any vegetation and it's within you know, more of a community private landowner setting, I would start with some of the more flammable non-native ornamental plants and reducing those first. And reducing those first. So yeah, the non-native high flammable plants. The next plants to go, this is really important in fuel reduction work or forest health, forest management work, is taking care of the invasive plants. Remove the invasive plants as soon as you can, and it is a priority. They can become some of the most flammable plants that we have in our communities. They can grow and spread quickly. They produce a lot of dead material. They are often found in openings between native plant patches or trees or things like that. So they are very effective at carrying fire across the landscape. And they can create very dense, very flammable ladder fuels, particularly Scotch broom. I guess we have Scotch and Spanish broom. Both of those are found in the Deer Creek watershed. So particularly with the broom, you've really got to dedicate yourself to taking care of those populations and coming up with a plan, a strategy to try to eliminate them, to monitor them, and to prevent their introduction into other areas. I didn't get a chance to put the name.
Hey, Denise, just interrupt for a second. Denise,
yeah.
Just two things. One, we have about 20 minutes to go, so I don't know how far along you are with your slides.
Oh my goodness.
I think
Yeah,
about
20
what's the
minutes,
most
yeah.
important to cover in the 15 minutes. Yeah, and then also Lisa's had her hand up for a while, so maybe if it's appropriate, if the question, Lisa, you have is apropos to the topic she's talking about now, let's hear it since I stopped her anyway. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, I think somewhat related. When you were talking about the incense cedars, we actually do have some more. We've taken down some over the years to prevent the ladder fuels, but we still have more to take down. And some of them are fairly tall, and it's hard to tell. How can you tell if like there's maybe a bird nesting in it or something? So I don't want to cut down a tree if there's a bird nesting in it, or do birds even nest in incense cedars?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They will, and they're not the preferred species. But yeah, if there's a nice little notch in one of the branches, yeah, sure, they will. They'll nest in there. I'll talk a little bit about the birds and trying to limit impacts to them in just a few minutes.
Okay, because sometimes it's just hard, like we always look, but you know, just with the number of branches and stuff, it's just not always obvious if there's something nesting there or not.
Right. Yeah, let me talk about that in just a little bit. I'll go into a little more detail. One of the worst parts of invasive plants is that they can degrade native plant and wildlife habitat, reducing the diversity and resiliency of the plants and wildlife in the area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife and watershed friendly practices. So Lisa, I think this will answer your question. There's a list of things that we should look at before we do fuel reduction or fuel treatment work. One thing that there is some information available online through the California Native Plant Society, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where you can learn about the rare plants and wildlife that could potentially be found in your area. And I've talked about those plants and wildlife earlier in the slide. I did research on both of these databases, and so that's something that you can do, as well as you can look around online under these two organizations. When we're doing fuel treatment work, we really need to think about the distribution, abundance, migration, habitat needs, and all of that of the wildlife that could potentially be impacted. I talked about that a little bit earlier about habitat needs. As far as birds and mammal dens and breeding and rearing of young, it's extremely difficult to find these species. One thing that the best thing to do would be to do your work outside of the breeding, rearing, denning times of birds and other wildlife. So that would be doing the work between October and February, so winter. Basically late fall to early spring. This time of year, starting around March 1st, and now like we're full on into bird nesting time and mammal denning and things like that. So what I would recommend doing is spend as much time as you can, both particularly in the early mornings and the early mornings and early evenings, watching those areas that you want to do fuel treatment in. If you see birds coming in and out, if you see them carrying nesting material, if you see them have food in their mouths and going in and out of the same location, it's very likely they have a nest. And which case you may, or most likely may not be able to find that nest. So I recommend to mitigate all the impacts is that you just don't work there. You just put it on the list for doing that later in the fall. If it has to be done, then you just need to take a little bit more time and get those binoculars out and look really close to try to avoid nests. However, even if you're thinning around a nest, the disturbance is something that could cause the parents to abandon the nest, the eggs, the young. Let's see, I've already talked about snags and downwood and the food sources and habitats. Those are really important things to identify and flag them so that they're not impacted when crews come through and do work, or even yourself, because it's really hard when you've got a chainsaw to see your bigger surroundings. So go ahead and just like put some flagging out there, some bright pink flagging, so you know the things that you want to protect, whether they're bird nests, dens, snags, food sources, things like that. I'm going to talk about riparian areas in a little bit. So timing, we talked about this. October through February is the important priority time for fuel treatment work to be done. Another thing regarding timing is during that October to February time frame, we often, hopefully, would be getting rain, snow, more winter type weather, and doing fuel treatment work with equipment, track chippers, and heavy equipment, masticators, can be extremely detrimental to soils, and causing soil compaction, which leads to a whole bunch of other impacts, longer term impacts on plants and wildlife. Oh yeah, over here we have a western pond turtle, which would be definitely are found in the Deer Creek watershed. They would lay their eggs more in woodland environments, not not in ponds or even right next to ponds. And generally they will be laying their eggs, and I think that's probably like June through August. So yeah, and they're going to be really hard for you to avoid. These are burrows that animal burrows or holes created by fallen trees and stuff like that. So it's really just best to try to not do that your fuel treatment work between October and February. Okay, so the goal of wildlife-friendly fuel treatments would be to maintain and enhance plant and wildlife habitat diversity. We can do that by retaining certain species, spacing certain species appropriately. We can leave a variety of native trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants in a variety of different patches or corridors. We can help create or protect structurally complex wildlife habitat like the downed logs and the snags. It is important in most environments to retain some overstory canopy. That overstory canopy helps provide shade, and which is helpful to both the soil and the plants that are growing under it. The amount of shade, that varies. There is no one size fits all. You're really working within the habitat type or the plant community and making decisions. You'll make different decisions with different plant communities relating to the canopy and how much you take out. One thing that is really important to support large trees that do provide a lot of wildlife habitat and shade is to thin the ladder fuels between the drip line of large trees. And that's going to help with water and nutrient availability, and it'll also help prevent fire from climbing up into the canopy. And we can protect things like, larger oaks or big old sugar pines, or even nice big manzanitas, which you come across often. And these are just different types of fuel reduction work that's happened. The one on the left is probably most like a shaded fuel break, where there's not really a lot of understory vegetation. And in fact, the trees that are marked in blue, you might be able to see that those are being marked to take out because they are spaced too closely to each other. There's too much competition, and there's a continuous canopy, which we're trying to open up that canopy a little bit to reduce crown fires, especially in shaded fuel breaks. So when we're doing our fuel treatment, some things to consider in planning. It's always a good idea to plan what you're going to do where. It's important to have openings in areas. Those openings help create the separation of fuels, which can stop, a fire from going completely across your landscape. They can allow regeneration of shade intolerant plant species. Some plants need to have those openings in order to germinate and or to flower. The openings provide habitat edges, which is a variety of microhabitats that many wildlife do very well in, as far as the edges between meadows and forests or riparian areas and chaparral, things like that. There's more diversity in general, more food, more habitat types and things like that. And patches. So we've got patches and openings. Kind of when we're planning a fuel treatment project, we want to have that mosaic. We want to have diversity. We want to have a little bit of everything. So that these patches of vegetation, they're important to provide cover from predators and weather while passing, through a landscape. They can move from patch to patch to patch. Birds, small mammals, things like that, even species that are hunting the birds and the small mammals. These patches should also be treated, but we really want to remove the highest flammability species, leaving the lowest flammability species that have the highest habitat value. So those were some of the berry producing and flower producing native plants that I showed you earlier. Let's see, the patches should be placed outside of the drip line of large trees as to not promote ladder fuels. And this mosaic of patches, openings, and corridors will vary. The sizes and locations will vary depending on your treatment area, your project area, as well as the species that you have there, and the slope and the fuel load and several other things. But here we have a nice a schematic, a picture of a nice diverse landscape. So riparian areas are incredibly important corridors for animal migration. They're important for mating, for food and water. They provide cooler temperatures, moisture retention in plants and soil, and they help support water infiltration, which is bringing that water down into the groundwater so that it's held in the soil, in the bedrock, and can be released into streams and creeks later in the year to be available for wildlife over a longer plants and wildlife over a longer period of time. Riparian areas absolutely do need fuel treatment. We should not be ignoring riparian areas. Often they're found at the base of a steep canyon, which could be one of the main ways that one of the main pathways that a fire would shoot up a canyon, going from the South Yuba River up the steep Deer Creek Canyon could really become a hot, catastrophic fire, as we have seen in the past with the Jones Fire. It's really important to protect these riparian areas so that they don't get heavily impacted by high severity fires. So things we can do in riparian areas are to thin out the dead and down branches. We can limb large trees and remove the young dense conifers that are surrounding those large trees, acting as ladder fuels. We really do want to maintain an overstory over these riparian areas to help with the moisture retention and temperature. With fuel treatment work, you really want to work in those areas with a much lighter touch. You don't want to pile, burn piles or chip piles into riparian areas, especially in areas where there's running water, ephemeral or intermittent streams, things like that. And one thing you also really don't want to do is allow heavy machinery into those riparian areas. Usually, probably, depending on how wide the riparian, the actual creek or stream is. You'd want to have like 100, maybe 150 feet or so on either side of that waterway, where you don't bring in heavy equipment, where you would ideally have hand crews go in and cut out the highly flammable species like the dense young conifers and things like that, and remove them from the riparian area and ship them outside of that riparian area. Some of the species that I've got down here, pictures and names, those are plants and trees that you would want to protect and not have cut in while you're treating riparian areas.
Hey, Denise, before you go
Yeah.
on to the next slide, how many more do you have? And I want to say that we're very close to 8 o'clock. And so I want to ask those still with us here if they want to continue on, assuming you have a lot more slides. Or how many do you have?
I have about 10 more slides.
Okay.
But, yeah,
and how long
some
do
of
you
them are
think that
pretty
would take? Let me just ask you, how long do you think that would take?
I think that would take about 20 minutes.
Okay, so let me ask the group, do you want to continue? Or is an hour and a half plenty? It's up to you guys. Does someone want to stay, or do we want to
We could
ask
just
Denise to maybe hit the highlights? Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe
Anybody?
we can record it and people who have to leave can watch it later. There's so much to talk about. It's like wildlife and fuel.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I would be happy to
Okay.
continue recording it, and people who have to leave or aren't here could watch it later, if that works.
Okay, so the suggestion
Could we
is we'll
also,
still continue for, yeah, go.
I was going to ask if we could get a copy of Denise's slides. So for those people that have to leave, there's a lot of good references in there. So without listening to the whole thing again, we could just get the slides.
Yeah, I can send the slides over.
It'd be great. The slides are beautiful.
They are.
Great. Yeah, it was hard
That
to
was in the
scale it
chat.
down.
So glad. Yeah.
When I timed it, I didn't time my like, oh, got to talk about this and got to talk about that. But anyway, yeah, it's all very interesting, I think. Well, should I carry on?
I guess.
I'm hearing that enough people want to hear you carry on that we may as well, and people who can't stay don't have to. That way we'll have a recording of the entire presentation. But the good news is then if you send the slides out, that those that don't want to listen to the whole thing can certainly find some very good information in the slides. So I guess I'm saying, yes, please continue. And let's, for those that want to stay, then she'll continue. Go ahead.
All right, well, so habitat piles. Habitat piles are something that can be created that they're not burn piles. These are habitat piles. I've got some information on how actually to build them and where they're located, where they should be located in fuel treatment areas. But these habitat piles do provide important refugia and homes for small mammals and understory birds and things like that. So they can be built in a way that are less flammable than burn piles, but still provide habitat. And they can be placed in areas that are ideal outside of the drip line of overhanging trees or away from dense manzanita, highly flammable manzanita patch. So they are important. A structural component that can be used in wildlife friendly fuel treatments. Okay, oaks. So we have a variety of oaks in Deer Creek Canyon: blue oak, black oak, interior live oak, canyon live oak, and even a brewer's oak, which is a picture down here on the lower right. In absence of fire, oaks can be overrun with dense conifers, dense patches of manzanita and other chaparral. But oaks are extremely important habitat. They provide an important food source, both with the pollen of the flowers and acorns. They provide nesting cavities for birds. And generally, with natural fire, they are fairly low flammability. And so if we can use the fuel treatment work to simulate fire by removing those dense ladder fuels around oak trees, that will help the trees survive in the event of, or when the next fire comes through, whether it's low, moderate, or high intensity. The oaks will have a better chance of surviving if they aren't surrounded by those ladder fuels. They'll also be healthier because they'll have less competition for nutrients in water. Okay, so let's talk about treatment options. I'm going to run through this really quick because I want to talk about the details of the treatments. The objectives are to basically reduce fire, reduce ladder fuels, reduce the chance of catastrophic fire. The objectives will vary based on the scale of the project, how many trees are removed, how many snags and downed wood can we keep. Maybe you aren't able to keep as much on a very steep slope. And also, what is the proportion of treated versus untreated areas within your project, your treatment area? So some of the treatment options that we have are thinning, which can be mechanical or manual, and then treatment of that slash after it's been cut. So mechanical treatments, those would be like masticators, skid steers, tractors, the things that the pros to those using that equipment is that it requires less hand labor, and so you're able to complete more work in a shorter period of time. And a lot of times projects are very limited on the duration of work that they can do due to the fire season, wildlife protections, or inclement weather like heavy snow or rain, in which you really don't want to have heavy equipment out there working. So some of the cons would be that they don't allow for the selective removal of dead, flammable, or invasive plants. It's really hard. It's more like mowing in a way where you can't just, you don't have a lot of choices of what you can and can't keep. These heavy equipment can compact soils, especially if it's during a rainy season. That compaction can decrease water infiltration. It can break up intricate networks between the plant's roots and the soil biology and the fungus and all of the other cool things that live in that plant soil area. Compaction is really bad for that. Loss of oxygen is it can be very detrimental. Also, heavy equipment has a higher chance of impacting terrestrial and burrowing animals. It can destroy dens, burrows, logs. It'd be really hard to know, where if Western pond turtle has laid their eggs there, or where are the Sierra Nevada newts, where are they estivating in woodlands and stuff. So it just has a lot more impact on the soil and all of the wildlife that lives in the soil. Additionally, you have to be very careful with using heavy equipment because they have a potential of introducing invasive plants into your work site. So it's really important that if you are using heavy equipment, that you make sure that it's clean and that it's been inspected to make sure that you were not introducing seeds of anything that could really take off in an area that has just had a fuel treatment. So here are some of the mechanical treatments, mastication. Here we've got an excavator with a masticating head, and over to the right is, I guess, just like a tractor with a different type of masticating head on it. They have different types of accessibility allowances. With mastication, it's might be more important in larger areas, but one of the problems with mastication is that it concentrates all of the material, the cut material, on the ground. And then oftentimes what happens is that you have sprouting shrubs growing through that matted dents of cut up material on the ground, which can actually increase the fire danger in areas that are masticated. Good operators with proper cutting equipment and a lot of experience can actually do a really good job with masticating. I think we really need to do a lot more education on people who are doing mastication and using heavy equipment for fuel reduction or fuel treatment, because it can be very destructive. I'm not going to talk a lot about scraping because it's awful. And basically, these are the reasons why. You can read removes topsoil and is a huge disturbance, opening up areas to invasive plant establishment, things like that. But if you do see somebody using a tractor to scrape or pile material for fuel reduction, it would be great if you if they were able to be educated. What comes back after such a harsh disturbance, such as scraping, can set you up for even more of a fuels problem. And it's just something that we really shouldn't be doing. Mastication, there's room for that. Scraping and removing topsoil, indiscriminately removing vegetation is not wildlife friendly or watershed friendly. I'll skip past here biological treatments fairly quickly. This is the use of grazing animals. There are people do this. In fact, I think that a portion of Hirschman's Pond, they had used goats for fuel reduction. In some areas, it might be a good idea, but things that are concerning to me is that they really need a lot of management to prevent overgrazing. And also sensitive plants and wildlife really need to be protected from goats trampling or grazing. And one thing that goats do that can be detrimental in the long run is they strip bark off of many of the plants, particularly riparian plants like willow and alder, stuff like that, but they'll also strip the bark off of manzanita, but they won't eat it. So you're basically just left with a stripped, dying or dead shrub or tree that doesn't really reduce the fuels overall. There are benefits in certain areas to using grazing animals for fuel reduction. Okay, so manual treatments, I've got just a couple more slides. This is my favorite. Because it's the least impactful. You've got hand crews using chainsaws and pole saws. Ideally, you have trained crews who can understand the goals of the project, maintaining plant and wildlife diversity, but reducing fuels. One of the biggest pros is that they can make educated workers can make that choice of, should I leave this or should I take it? Does it provide habitat or is it high fire risk? Other things that manual treatments do is they allow for workers to identify and protect downed wood, snags and wildlife habitat, things like that. They can keep their eyes out for nesting bird activity or wildlife dens. So just more eyes on the ground, and you can be a lot more sensitive and make much more informed choices on the best vegetation to leave and the best vegetation to remove. And they are a lot lighter. These types of treatments are a lot lighter on the soil, reducing soil compaction and help prevent erosion. And the big con with manual treatments is that you need a lot of hand labor, and it can be very time consuming. Some projects don't allow for that, whether it's the labor isn't available to do the work, or the work window is too short in order to complete the work. So oftentimes good fuel treatments can be a mix of manual treatments and mechanical treatments. Manual treatments would be in more sensitive areas. The mechanical treatments would be maybe in less environmentally sensitive areas. And finally, I've been using these terms intermittently because it's a habit, but we have, when we're doing fuel treatment work, we have fuel reduction or we have fuel rearrangement. Fuel reduction means that the fuel disappears. The only way for the fuel really to disappear is if we burn it, if we do burn piles or controlled burns, which are extremely beneficial and necessary for healthy ecosystems. But oftentimes with what we're left with is the choice of chipping, masticating, or lop and scattering the material that's been cut. And all those three options are really just a rearrangement of fuels. Nothing's really disappeared. Fuels might start to decompose a little bit faster if they're than if they're standing, tall in the forest. But there are concerns with having all of this cut or chipped material on the forest floor. And that is that they can smother plants, they can reduce native plant germination or survival, they can reduce water infiltration into the soil and the roots of plants, and they can also be flammable. In addition, the lop and scatter method, certain times of year, especially in the spring, when you have a lot of cut conifer species laying on the ground, it produces I don't know if it's a hormone, I can't remember what it is, but basically it alerts bark beetles that there is available food material. So there are different concerns about different ways of getting rid of the fuel. And so a mixture of all of these might be the best. Again, providing more of a diverse mosaic type of treatment. Here are some treatment examples. Up here on the left is a site that I did with reduction of dead material in a dense chaparral manzanita stand. And down here on the right is a light fuel reduction project that was done on a mixed conifer forest. There were a lot of sugar pines and madrones in this forest, which I ended up keeping and mostly removed the young and overstocked conifer species with the incense cedar, Douglas fir primarily. Okay, so summary of the talk is that number one, it's not just wildfire that's the problem. Yes, wildfire is becoming more catastrophic because of many reasons, but really when it comes to protecting communities and homes, it's an ignition problem. We really need to focus on hardening our structures and creating defensible space for homes and communities. That's the only way we're going to be able to protect us. However, we know that fire is going to be coming through the Deer Creek Canyon, the Deer Creek watershed, and that is a good thing. Native plants and wildlife have evolved with fire. However, due to all of the fuel suppression, climate change, drought, things like that, forest and vegetation management is absolutely needed, even in riparian areas. And there are ways that we can do wildlife-friendly fuel treatment by incorporating practices that minimize impacts and conserve biodiversity by maintaining habitat heterogeneity during treatments. So heterogeneity, just a whole diverse, diverse group of microhabitats that each, certain wildlife have evolved to survive in. And finally, as far as the fuel treatments, manual treatments can have environmental and aesthetic benefits over mechanical or biological treatments. They can be much more sensitive to wildlife and impacts on native plants and animals. However, mechanical treatments may be necessary due to the size and scale of your work project. Also the limited work windows between October and February, and also project funding. Project funding might require that either financially or on a schedule that mechanical treatments are necessary. However, if you can use manual treatments in areas that are sensitive for wildlife and native plants, that would be ideal. And that's it. Questions if there's anybody there, and if folks had to leave or weren't present for the Zoom presentation, here is my email and phone number, and I would be happy to talk with you about any of your questions or concerns. This is something that I'm really passionate about, and really want to work with the community to make the best decisions for our watershed.
You obviously know a whole lot about this topic, and to restate what someone else asked, I'd love to see those slides, and maybe the way to do this would be to send them to Francis. And Francis can send how we do that.
Yeah, I'm here.
Denise, I was going to say it was great information. Thank you for taking the time to put this together and meeting with us. It was just a lot of really good stuff.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Asking.
Thank you, Denise. That was great. And thanks for answering the questions as well. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Okay.
Have a great evening.
Yeah,
Let me know if you have questions.
Okay. Just
Thank you,
checking.
Denise. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.